Oh,
Steve Kirtland. Hello.
Ooh.
Nice to see you. Judge
Bonjour.
Steve, hi. Happy New Year. Hi, Carolyn. Hi. And Julian, is that Julian? Yay!
Wow.
Happy New Year. A long time no see.
Gathering from all over the world.
Yeah,
Really?
this is really fun.
Julian, you're quite dark.
The pictures.
We want to see every hair that's standing up there.
And Marco is here. How nice.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark. Yeah. Okay, we're getting the thumbs up from Emily, and I guess Anne and Janine will stay up on YouTube. Hi, Sue.
Okay.
Yay. You've been doing wonderful things, I hear. Oh, look, Anne came. Nice.
Here comes Anne and Janine.
And Tyler says, oh, John Martin is saying hi to Kaiser.
So good morning, everyone. January 1, 2023.
And it's
we are Dawn Mountain, and we are broadcasting from Diamond Dawn Mountain, which is in the outskirts of Capitan, New Mexico. We are sitting in our shrine room in our retreat house, and where we have spent the last month. And the space is pervaded by light, so we've got everything shuttered, but it's still quite bright, I think. It is lovely to see all of you, and we are beginning a new year, and given the last 2 years, we certainly pray that there is improvement for everyone all around. There have been many, many challenges, many, many losses, and many, many divisions and animosities have been stirred, and the world feels like it's in a more perilous place, which is unfortunate, but we bring our practice to this situation, and we try to remain steady in our orientation, which is grounded in compassion and oriented towards wisdom. And being human, we will always be a bit short of what our ideals are. It's January 1, and it's a time when in our culture, we seem to be oriented towards thinking about changing our lives. What a wonderful, rich, and complicated topic. I put in the chat, and maybe Emily will re-put it in, because I understand if we put things in the chat before you come on, you won't see it. One of Anne's students recommended a book to her called The More Beautiful World Our Heart Knows Is Possible. And I can't actually say just yet if I thoroughly approve of this book or not, which is interesting. But what the author's name is Charles Eisenstein, and he basically, I think, correctly analyzes the situation of the world as really rather difficult, and that every layer from the personal to the social is interrelated. And he talks about that we're all currently in what he calls a story of separation, which, interestingly enough, I think if we translated it into a Buddhist metaphor, would be a story of duality, where we create dualities, we live in dualities, we perceive in dualities. Somewhere recently, and I can't remember where, I ran across a phrase about binaries. And I think it's very, very useful to be aware of the binaries we can get stuck in. And interestingly enough, binaries are another word for dualism. And when we teach Buddhism, and Dzogchen in particular, one of the things that's often talked about is resolving duality and dualism. And I think if we translate that into a more colloquial language, we can talk about issues of separation. We can talk about issues of binaries. And so when we look at the beginning of the year and the proverbial New Year's resolutions, looking at this book as just a source of some inspiration, he wants us to look at things in terms of interbeing, which is, I think, a kind of Thich Nhat Hanh term. And as I was reflecting on it in our Buddhist teachings, there is actually a phrase that covers that, but it never occurred to me before to think of it in terms of interbeing. But we use a phrase which just means union. In Tibetan, it's zungjuk, and in Sanskrit, it's yuganada. It's a very, very significant phrase. It has a lot of connotations, but it's in contrast to dualism, is a sense of union, things coming together. How does this relate to our New Year's resolution world? Well, one way is that it's a bit of a related to, I think, what I may have talked about even in our last first Sunday, which is how do we relate to ourselves when we're considering something like change, improvement, taking on a spiritual discipline. And it's very, very tricky. In a kind of untutored world, we will often get into a kind of struggle with ourselves. There's very, very much abroad in the land in our culture, this sense of, well, you just need to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. And this has a lot of mental health, we call them sequelae, meaning things that are related to this view. But one of them that I see often, both in the spiritual life and as a therapist, is that we have some values, we orient ourselves to moving towards those values, which is all very, very good. And when we don't live up to our values, we'll very, very often say, well, I'm just so stupid, I'm a loser, I'm really not able to move forward. I can't, I'm a terrible person. And whether we actually verbalize this to others or we just sort of keep it internally, there is this war in the self, from the self towards the self. And it's very, very painful when we inhabit it. Very, very painful to hear. Very, very painful to see. And I think we've all seen it in ourselves, and we all see it in those we love and those we care about. This, I call it the sort of penitente, beating oneself with chains that many, many of us fall prey to. And I think those of you who have been listening to me for more than one session know that one of my big bugaboos is really to talk to people about self-flagellation and self-criticism and self-hatred. It's so painful. It's enormously painful. It's enormously painful to feel, to swim in, to live in, and to see. And so one of the binaries is a binary between I wish to improve myself and I don't wish to destroy or flagellate myself in the process. It's a really, really significant kind of tension. One of the ins on working with this kind of binary has to do with the word savor. When I was contemplating this talk for today, for whatever reason, savor, favor came to my mind. A sweet kind of pear. And savor is actually a very lovely, lovely word. And, I think that for myself, we all live in metaphors and we talk in metaphors and we teach in metaphors. And, just take two words, mindfulness or savor. And mindfulness is to be aware of something. Savor is to be aware of something, but it really relates to the tongue and the nose. And we could also use the word touch into something. When we say mindfulness, it sort of starts resonating with, everything above the eyebrows. We say touch, it has a completely different resonance. We say savor, it also has a different resonance. What we teach and practice on Sunday mornings when we practice meditation is savoring our breath. And what does this have to do with this whole issue of self-improvement and change and New Year's resolutions? Well, many of us don't know how to savor. Many of us are so zippity-doo-dah that we're spinning in our cognitive world. I don't think most of us recognize how absorbed we are in just thinking, just cognition. And one of the actually difficulties of learning meditation is that initially, when we start slowing ourselves down, when we start paying attention to our breath, something very, very simple, all of a sudden we become aware of the laugh riot that's going on in our minds, our thoughts, our zippity-doo-dah. I should do this, I should do that, I shouldn't have done this, I shouldn't have done that. What if, I've got to take care of this, I've got to take care of that. We all, again, in our current situation, live with an enormous amount of anxiety. And our response to that anxiety is a kind of to-do. Many, many of us want to do things to resolve our anxiety, whether it's our internal state or things that have to do with the external cultural and social situation. And it's not to say we shouldn't. And we're talking about the whole idea of New Year's resolutions. But there is really a different model available. And that model does have to do with savoring. So instead of getting lost in I should do this, I should do that. People say I should do this. The people in our culture feel this is the right thing to do. And I know all these right things to do. And is to actually slow down. One way of slowing down is practicing mindfulness of the breathing, or to do nothing and to just be, and to start sensing into a whole other range of information, namely our emotional and our feeling world. What am I feeling? Well, often in the transition from a completely cognitive zippity-doo-dah style of being, what we initially start feeling is a lot of not so pleasant emotions and feelings in our body. We start sensing how contracted and tense we are. And there is a transition if we're moving from just a very, very reactive perspective to one that is more grounded in using, the form of teaching that Anne has developed with Adzam Rinpoche, more resting in being as opposed to seeing and seeking. We don't ever want to get rid of seeing and seeking. We don't want to get rid of our cognition and our thought process. But we do want to open up a different mode of relating to the world that allows us to savor both internally what's occurring and externally what we're perceiving. It's a very, very different perspective when we're in conversations with others. If we are trying to savor what they're saying and feel how it's impacting us, versus I've got an agenda, I've got to change this person's view, and I've got to make them think the way that I think. It's okay to have the latter perspective, but it's a way, way different perspective to allow ourselves to feel into our experience and sense what it is that others are experiencing. Out of an allowance of really sensing what we're feeling, savoring what's going on in us, there's a much quieter voice that may speak to us, a voice of intuition, a voice of inner direction, a voice of something related to our Buddha nature. It's interesting in the way we've been teaching recently, we're kind of seeing there is a level of practice which involves planning, training. It's very, very important. There's also a level of practice where things emerge spontaneously. And this is a little bit of a preview and a trailer for what we'll be talking about in the first Sunday of February with Kaisu, in terms of kind of spontaneous freshness. Can we be in touch with something that is really authentically us, that comes about through our quieting down and sensing what our inner direction is, as opposed to getting into some kind of war with ourselves of like, I should, I have to. And again, this is not a binary. It's, can we add this kind of voice to our life in general? What feels right? What sense is right? What do I savor as really the authentic orientation I wish to be expressing now in my life? So I throw this out as just something to continue to marinate with. And I'm going to see if Anne would like to contribute something at this point. We talked about her having something to say.
Yes. So hello again, everyone. This is such a rich topic, and perhaps it's helpful to name a few strands that each deserve individual attention. And yet in this brief time together today, we can look into how they relate to each other. When, in order to savor, in order to be present, in order to feel less separate from the people that we're talking to, from our own internal issues, in order to come into more of a state of wholeness. It's a very important state, a wholeness, a little bit like what we've just heard about, not feeling separate, feeling connected. We need to be somewhat settled. We need to be permeable. That is, to be able to hear what is being offered to us, to be able to see what's around us, rather than being in, same old mode. And all of these things really, we can say, are interwoven in one of the first teachings, actually, of our traditional trajectory of practices, the foundational practices. Listening. What does listening mean? To listen in the context, it is discussed in terms of listening to the teaching. And we have, following our friend the Lama Willa, looked also into deep listening, that when we with each other, with our friends, our parents, our children, our work colleagues, listening is also important. We don't just listen to the Dharma in our lives. We listen to the teaching that anyone is giving while they are speaking to us, she points out in this way. And to listen, I like this word permeability, because when we talk with someone or talk with ourselves in this sort of harsh way that Harvey has illustrated, we have an agenda. I don't really want to hear what you have to say. I want to get to the place where I tell you what I've been thinking about and what's exciting to me, and or what I think you should be focused on. That's a very familiar state, I would say. At least it's familiar to me, when we get into a conversation. And if we drop into the situation, what is happening is that we're not exactly listening. We're waiting for a cue where we can go on and carry forward our agenda. And this is could call it a defensive mechanism, or it's some way of remaining separate. It's a pretty subtle way of remaining separate. We may have our eyes open and be hearing, but we're not listening. We're certainly not savoring. We're editing reality. We want to get past this part of it till we get to this other part of it where I can sing my song, and whatever happens to you is maybe not so much on my plate. So I think this is actually very significant. The more years go by, personally, the more I appreciate how this is where really the training of a practitioner begins. How to listen, which also means how to be permeable. It also means listening is an interesting thing. because on the one hand, it is a tender kind of intimacy to listen, to actually hear and see what is going on with the person in front of you. And there's also kind of letting go, let them do what they want. And maybe even on the meditation cushion in a certain way, when things come up, let it be. Let it be. So there's acceptance involved. Two things on this, kind of different images that come to mind or points that come to mind. Suzuki Roshi, famous Zen teacher, opened the San Francisco Zen Center and wrote a wonderful book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. It's a classic. I use it in almost all my courses, if you haven't read it. And in the opening pages, he has the wonderful metaphor of a wild horse. And he's suggesting that, I would add, in certain contexts, we think of ourselves as a wild horse. That's not too hard. We sit down and try to watch our breath. The wild horse is running. How do you tame a wild horse, he says? Well, there are methods, as we know from our Western culture. You put the bit in the horse's mouth, you get the horse to learn to respond to the reins, and that's one way. And Suzuki Roshi, I think in a way that's very helpful for us in this context, says, no, the way you tame a wild horse is you let it run in the open field as much as it wants. It will stop running. It will relax. And it turns out that relaxing is key to so many aspects of what we are trying to do. And you cannot do relaxing. Relaxing also means relaxing a kind of, the binary or the self-other or the I-it, this kind of dualistic universe that we experience, as ordinary mind always experiences, takes actually some effort to hold together. We don't do it when we come out of the womb. We have to learn and we have to train. There is some naturalness already in our body and being that we can learn to trust, tap into, relax, let the horse run, let your person that you're listening to say their piece, let your own voice say its piece. You don't, the wild horse isn't, you're not jumping on it to ride it either. You're allowing. And then if we're observing the breath, if we're observing sound, I'll say a little bit about this before we actually do our practice, we're in a state of greater wholeness. When we are after ourselves to do this and do that, I don't know if you experience it this way, but for me, it's become very meaningful to think in terms of relative states of wholeness, connectedness with oneself, with others. It doesn't mean that those little voices go away, but we don't give them quite as much pass. We don't jump on them and ride them, and we can be more relaxed. And it turns out that relaxation in our traditions of practice has a lot to do with what traditional Buddhists called purification, which can also be called training. Same word actually in Tibetan, Jang, to train, to purify, which means that we grow a little less harnessed by our thoughts, our ideations, our habits of feeling separateness. So these are big topics, and they also converge in a kind of state of more oriented perhaps toward letting be and allowing, opening the parameters of me-ness that often are so enclosing. So I want to stop with that so that we will have some time before our our practice, and wish us all whatever you have heard now that has been helpful to you, maybe one or two things, tuck them away, keep them in your mind, savor them, and let them permeate you and allow perhaps an easier sense of freedom, at least some of the time.
So we'll probably take a minute or two to have a pause. I think there's probably a need to change out broadcasts. So we'll take a minute or two and then we'll come back for our morning meditation. See you all soon.
With continued good wishes.